Hello, my name is Rodney Johnson. I'm a food scientist and have worked in the food and beverage and dietary supplement industry for a number of decades. And I'm here today to talk about the product development process or the research and development process. How do you design and develop a dietary supplement and maybe compare it a little bit to the foods and beverages development process? And so without further ado, let me share my screen. And this is what we're talking about. Here is the agenda. I'll give you a little bit more of an introduction, and then we will kind of go and do an overview of the product development process, keying in on differences between supplements and foods, and then also look at, before you get to product development, the technology development, which is in order to get it ready to move into product development. And then establishing the target profile, what it is that you're trying to develop, is a critical step. And then as part of that, there should be consideration of what claims you're going to make, so you can ensure the team that you're going to be able to substantiate those claims during the development process. Then I'll talk about the formula and the process and the package. They're actually, those three are a triad and are integrally related. And then we'll talk about how you develop those prototypes, formulas, processes, and packages, and refine and iterate. And we'll talk through the process of scaling it up, going from a bench ultimately into production. And then finally, once in production settings, shakedown and make sure everything works the way it's supposed to. And then as time goes on, you as an R&D person or product development person will want to help maintain that production and sustain the business and ultimately grow the business. So that's overall what we'll be talking about today. So first of all, let's talk about a few terms. Dietary supplement, which I just call supplements hereafter, are regulated, contrary to common misinformation. Their regulations are similar to pharmaceuticals and foods, not exactly the same. GMPs are critical, good manufacturing practices. And for the record, all of these things are the best practices. There are players that don't do things the right way, and you can make compromises and you can have poor product as a result. But good manufacturers, quality producers, and quality R&D organizations will do the right thing to make it a legitimate dietary supplement. The typical forms for dietary supplements are tablets, soft gels, and capsules, but they can be a food format, like a ready-to-drink or ready-to-mix beverage. Gummies are a big deal now. Shots, gels, and bars, those are all possible formats for a dietary supplement. The critical difference for a dietary supplement is the health benefit claims, or the claims on the label, which cannot be done in foods. There can be made if it's permitted by regulatory requirements and you have substantiation of that health benefit claim for your product. Also, another difference is the supplement facts label, which is compared to a food and beverage, which has a nutrition facts label. Really, the difference is a matter of the type of information and the detail, and again, in supplements, making claims. Raw materials, I'll call them ingredients, are typically the components of the formula, and they typically have a function not only in the product, for texture or flavor, but in the case of dietary supplements, they work in the person. They may help modulate the immune system or improve cognitive performance. The formula is often called a recipe to the layperson, but it's just a list of the raw materials and the amounts. Foods and beverages are very similar, but they use a nutrition facts label. They do not have active ingredients. There's much more of a focus on organoleptic, or sensory is really more a simple term for it. And so those are really the main differences. Just to highlight a few of those others, again, supplements, standardized raw materials, they function in the body, they have a purpose as well. The raw materials also have to function in the product or to make the product. For example, in supplements, there has to be the ability for the powder to flow and then to compress. It also has to have the right sensory characteristics. Raw materials for foods, on the other hand, tend to be more general, flour, for example, or sugar, or things of that general nature, and then focus on sensory and not as much, and not on the function, although nutrients and function in the product is also an important part for the formulation with raw materials in foods. The labels are different. I mentioned that. You can make health benefit claims in dietary supplements. You cannot make those health benefit claims. You can make nutrient content, and you can make sensory claims. Tastes better than competitor X, but you have to have data to support that claim. Testing is a big deal, and I'll talk more about that later, but really the testing for supplements is much more extensive. They have to test for the label claim in the product at the end of its shelf life. It has to be what's on the label at the end of shelf life. There is obviously some focus on sensory stability, but there's also a focus on the stability of the actives. And in all cases, microbiology, is it free of pathogens, is important. In the case of foods, it's the nutrient content that you're focused on, as well as the microbiology, not as much on active components that are active in the person. So that's kind of an overview of that aspect of the product development process. And talk about how you define the product profile. The product profile is a definition of what is to be developed by the R&D folks. And it includes a number of things such as what are the proposed claims. Typically marketing will say, hey, we want a product that helps people with their immune system or helps their brain work better. Those are considered consumer benefits. But if you want to have that converted into something on the label, a product claim, it has to meet certain regulatory requirements, as well as have the substantiation that it actually does what you're saying it does. I talk quite a bit about that in a little bit later. Typically, if you want a successful product, it should be addressing an unmet consumer need and should be meaningfully differentiated from what other consumers or other products are being provided to the consumers. Because if you wanted an edge, there has to be some way to distinguish your product, your solution from what other people are marketing. If it's new to the world, new to the brand, those are also important to understand because it also represents what might be challenges as you move down the development process. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on when we talk about technology development a little bit later. That's, as you can see on the diagram on the right, basically moving from an emerging science ultimately to meet the consumer's need. The specifications for the product are really the critical characteristics of what it is that you're developing. What are the constraints? You know, does it have to be organically certified product, or is it okay to have organically certified raw materials? Does it need to be a clean label? Is there a certain volume expectation or cost? And specific raw materials need to be excluded or included. Whole Foods has a long list of raw materials that cannot be included in their products. So that's another consideration that would go on in a product profile. The package also is typically defined here, although that will be dictated to a certain extent by the product form. And the form, should it be a tablet, is fairly straightforward, or capsule, soft gels. But if it's food, it could be a beverage, it could be a ready to drink or ready to mix, those types of things. And ultimately, what marketing needs to know is what is the cost. You have a constraint that is the cost that out the door so that they can determine what the margins are going to be. So that's defining what you need to do. But again, as part of the best practices to actually have some of the homework done at this early stage. In some cases that's done, in other cases it's not. But if you really look at the best practice, you look at the development before you get to product development. And so you're looking for solutions for consumers, and you have to scour the market to see what's out there. And typically these are some of the sources that you find new technologies or new ideas that can help address a consumer need. Everywhere from inside the company to a contract manufacturer, to your own customers, startups, academia. These are all typically who will be engaged with, who you may want to engage with to bring in new technologies and new ideas that can address that consumer need. The ideal, or at least from my perspective as a scientist, I like to see things moving from an emerging science where it's not clearly and well understood. That means there's not a lot of products out there on the market. There's nothing. And so when it moves from emerging science to a point where that it can be applied and actually is a technology, that step is a technology development step. And that will often happen before product development. Then that feeds into the product development process that ultimately meets the consumer need and is the final food product, that is the application or supplement, dietary supplement application. So that tends to be a cyclic process where certain applications require a new science or new technology to be able, that pushes the emerging science and it goes around to develop new technology and round. Not all emerging science is directly the result of somebody wanting to make something, but it is often that a certain application is driving the science to ultimately get to development. So that's ideally done before you get to the profile, not necessarily being done, but it should be done in conjunction. If you wait to the development process to do some of the development of the technology and to look at that you actually have something that's viable, the probability of success is decreased. And so you want the high risk type of tasks, the new technology development, before you start product development. The product development process should have a level of risk that's probability of failure is probably in the 5 to 10% range. The probability of success, is putting it positively, is more in the 90% range. If you're looking at a technology development, it can be anywhere from 25% to 90% probability of success. So you want that high risk material done before. Not always done. Sometimes it gets shoved into the development process. Not ideal, but then the team has to accept the risk associated with that. So let's look at the overall product development process. A very general statement is that it is a multiple parallel work stream. Okay, there's a lot of people doing a lot of different things all at the same time. Cross-functional, that's a lot of different people. And iterative, meaning you may have to do the same type of task repeatedly to try to optimize the product. Iterative set of business processes. So that's really what it is. A bunch of people working together to ultimately get to a final product that can be manufactured. The first step is defining the product, the definition, the target, the profile. And that we'll talk quite a bit about later on. But in general, if you look at the overall development process for dietary supplements, it can be anywhere from 3 months to 3 years. I've worked on projects that had that range. 3 months tend to be of high risk, super fast, not the most comfortable approach. 3 years is more when you have a very high complex global market and have a low risk tolerance, you think are probably going to have to take quite a bit more time to really go through it. Who's involved in development includes the following. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean there's a person for each of these functions, but in some fashion, by some person, these functions are being accounted for during the development process. The development team includes the formulation scientist, package and process engineers, regulatory or legal. Regulatory also often gets involved in safety, as well as quality getting involved with safety. Supply chain and manufacturing, often combined. Marketing, project manager, someone who's running the whole project, and then the analytical scientists that have to do a lot of the testing, which is extensive, as we'll talk about in a bit. Project cost is variable depending on what you're starting with. If it's something that's new to the world, it'll tend to cost more. If it's something that's simply a line extension, it would probably be a lot less. My experience has been that I have been able to develop a dietary supplement type product for around $70,000, depending on some intricacies. There's always a few extra charges that may not be visible in just a single number, but a critical piece of this is that if you define the product very well at the onset, you will find that you have fewer scope changes during the development process. And that's important because as you go further down the development stage and you make a change, say you want to change a package from one kind of container to another kind of, glass to a plastic. Well, that's a big change because that will change the type of manufacturer, who is your manufacturer. And so all the definition and the changes and identifying what is important should be done at the product profile. Reality is it's very common, most common, that there are changes made during the development process. That's just the reality. But that's the way it costs more, but marketing wants something a little bit different, or they need to tweak it. That's the way it typically happens. A co-man is a contract manufacturer, and that's the group that's used to manufacture the product if the development company is different from the company that manufactures the final product. That's typically for smaller companies. I've worked for companies that have many factories, many plants, and then you simply work with your internal folks. If it's an outside manufacturer, contract manufacturer, then developing a relationship and working directly with the contract manufacturer to do the development is very important. And it's often a place where things fall down. The communication between the contract manufacturer and the developers has to be at a high level throughout the entire development process, or it leads to errors. So if you've developed a product, or if you develop a profile and you're saying, okay, this is what I really want, and you really want to be able to make these claims, it would behoove you to first do the testing and have an understanding how likely it is that you're going to be able to substantiate a claim that you want to make. This is often done during the course of development, but again, ideally, best practices would be to do this work before you get into the hardcore development of a final product. So if you look at a product profile, you as I've mentioned before, you have the target consumer benefit, and then you're proposing some claims which require some regulatory compliance that ultimately could go to a label claim. Efficacy has to be demonstrated and shown. Best case data for efficacy is clinical studies. That is on the material that you're going to be used in the actual tablet, double blind, complete placebo controlled, double blind. Nobody knows which is the actual test and which is the placebo. And there is a placebo crossover. So one group that did it stops using it and switches over and stops using it, and vice versa, the two groups. And multi-center, if you have it done at more than one organization, is ideal. That's expensive, time consuming, and not always the most convenient approach to do it. So another alternative, and it's very common, is to use third-party literature. The challenge there is defining the raw materials that are used in the clinical study in the third-party literature. That's the same as what you're putting in your product. There has to be an analogous, actually, ideally identical to what was used in the clinical is in your product. If not, it should be characterized to the point where you're sure that it is going to function the same as was in the original clinical study. The other types of proof include people that might already be using it. You go into Reddit, you can find all kinds of people trying all kinds of strange things. It gives you some information. Animal studies, also useful, but with their limitations as to applicability to humans. Understanding at a biochemical level, the mechanism of action. And that can be done simply by knowing what it is that your function that you're trying to have an effect. Or you can use in vitro or in test tube types of tests, such as a bioassay looking at biological activity. Or gene expression. Does it upregulate or downregulate the genes that are responsible for the function or target functions? For example, immune optimization. Upregulation or downregulating genes relating to the immune system. In vivo tests are done in actual animal, and it's sometimes done in combination of in the animal and then external. Ethnobotany is really traditionally used. It's where people are using this, have used this traditionally for years and years. Echinacea, American Indians, it goes way back into time. India Indians and ashwagandha has a long, long history. So all of those pieces can fit into the ethnobotanical and help build a dossier that says that we have the data to substantiate this claim. Excuse me, and can be provided to the FDA should they come knocking. The development of the prototype formula and process, and actually package as part of this, is a multi-step process, and again, iterative, where you do some of the initial testing or do some of the initial setup, try it, and then go back and do it again. You usually start with a theoretical formula spreadsheet or using some software that'll help you define what is the raw materials you want to include and the content that would be in the serving size that you have decided to establish. The other considerations when you're developing a formula is how is it going to be consumed? Is it going to be in a capsule or tablet? There you look at flow. If it's going to be in a ready to mix beverage, you look at dissolvability and dispersibility. So those are things that you come into consideration as you're developing it. Obviously, the label claims are critical, and so that is what's targeted during the theoretical calculation. When you're considering how much to put in there, you have to consider loss over time. Product stability is not forever, and you need to test and ensure that you have an overage, an amount over what the label is, so that even at the end of its 2-year shelf life or whatever shelf life it is, it still has the label claimed amount. And then you have to take into consideration serving size and recommended use. It should be something relatively simple for a consumer. One of the challenges with formulation is raw materials. Typically, supplement raw materials are natural raw materials and therefore have a fair amount of variability in particle size, particle shape, distribution. As you see in this little picture here, it's not uncommon that you have just a very wide variety of shapes and sizes that you have to ultimately mill or change or modify in some process to be able to put it into a final product. And that can present some challenges in terms of making a uniform product. So what you are going to do, as I mentioned, once you've made some of these little prototypes, you usually do it in a small size, a bench size. That's usually a few grams, no packaging. It's just maybe a small plastic bag that you put it in, and maybe hand out a few samples to willing testers or victims, however you want to look at it. And you try it. You also can use that sample for doing some testing, chemistry, other types of things, not microbiology, because you're touching it and it's not really being created in a completely sanitary fashion. Pilot plant size is a medium scale. It's larger, typically maybe more of a few pounds, may or may not have the actual packaging. And ultimately, you want to get to the larger scale of production, and that can either be at a plant trial, which does not make saleable goods and has to be discarded or managed in some fashion, or production startup, where you go directly into production that can be saleable goods, higher risk, but potentially lower cost if you don't have to discard the amounts that would have been done in a plant trial. So scaling it up is really changing from one size to the next, and adjusting the formula, the package, and the process specific to the size. They are intimately linked, and so therefore need to be considered as a whole when you're doing the development. Typically, you will have a package engineer or process engineer or someone who has a background in that area to help work through some of the details on the formula. And then once you have some of these prototypes together, you want to do the label claim, chemistry, microbiology, if it's sanitary, and sensory testing. And then based on that feedback, you refine and adjust the process and the formula, and then repeat and do the testing. You'd iterate in some cases in an informal fashion. In other cases, you do an experimental design to optimize the critical factors. And that would be more of the best practice. Not always done, but is one of the approaches that can be used and is successful. Both ways work. It's a matter of how formal you want to be and how much risk you want to take. I put this up here as a little bit of humor because I know as a food scientist, I've done a lot of food products, and sometimes the evaluation of prototypes is a little bit overwhelming. This depicts how it might be testing prototypes for some type of a cake. I actually was in a chocolate chip cookie trained taste panel, and I thought, wonderful, I'm going to eat lots of chocolate chip cookies. To this day, I'm not overly enthused about chocolate chip cookies because I had so many of them in that testing. At any rate, moving along, as I said, testing is a big deal, and so it's important, and it's often one of the factors that executives are not aware of and are really less inclined to think is critical, but it is very important. Executives and marketing tend to have a focus more on the timing and not necessarily, not all marketers, not all executives, but this is just a general tendency, are not as concerned about these details. But they are, that does not mean they're not important. They are very important, and you can make or break a product based on what testing you do or you don't do. Heavy metals, there's a whole series of impurities such as heavy metals, mycotoxins, microbiology, bacteria, pesticides. Those are just a few. It depends on the particular system, but those are the ones that you want to look at to make sure that you don't have unacceptable levels of these impurities. On the other hand, you want to make sure you have an adequate amount of the active compounds. It has to have the right potency. It has to have the right active constituents or marker compounds, compounds that represent the activity that can be measured. In the case of tablets, you want to look at the flow of the powder to make a tablet, and then disintegration and dissolution or dissolving of the tablet or capsule or soft gel, ultimately so that it is dissolved in the gut and actually can be assimilated. Identification, pretty simple in something straightforward like cocoa. Not simple when you look at a brown powder from a plant that you get into receiving and you don't know what it is. So you have to test the composition, and from that you may get, if it's a plant material, you'll have some markers or some compounds that you can test to confirm that it's the correct genus and species. And that's important for all plant materials. And that is not necessarily a simple thing. It's where it does take technical expertise to ensure that you have what you say you're going to have in there. Same common names are used in different countries for different plants. So that's where I've run into problems on that in the past. Sensory is important more on the food side, but also tablets, you generally don't want them to have a bad aroma. Sometimes you can't avoid it, and that's just the way it is. For example, valerian root smells really bad, and the tablets smell really bad. You open up it and it smells like dirty socks, and that's just the way it is. But people now sort of associate that bad smell with functionality. So there has to be an understanding of the sensory attributes of the particular product that you're looking at. Analytical test methods are a really big deal, because if you don't have adequate precision and accuracy, you can test till you're blue in the face and you won't have a correct answer, and you run into problems. If some material is in at a very low level, it could be below the level of quantification, so you may have to tweak the process. And in some cases, the method may not even exist. And so you need to take the time, money, and effort to develop a method so that in your particular soft gel or tablet matrix, you can pull out the actives and measure it in a reliable fashion. And again, the reason you're testing these is to make sure it's safe and it's functional and it's doing what it's supposed to do. It has the nutrient content that you want it to have. And you also have to look at stability. How is it to, initial values? How are the active constituents stable or maintaining over time? Are there degradation products that you need to be aware of and manage? So that's some of the key aspects of testing, and it's often underrated as being, yeah, we got to do it, but it's really critical to best practices and a high quality product. Once you've developed a number of prototypes and are satisfied with what it looks like and what it tests like, you want to begin the process of scaling it up to ultimately into the production setting. And typically you have to increase the batch size, but does not mean you increase everything proportionate to the size, because the weight, for example, a blender at a small scale at a certain RPM has very different forces and energy involved at a very large blender operating at the same RPMs. So the scale up is not a simple 1-to-1 or 1-to-5 expansion of everything. And so there have to be tweaks and tests done to confirm that it actually will run in that particular equipment in the long term. And then once you've made some of the product, you also again test to confirm the label claim and what you're wanting to do, and also to establish the label itself, the supplement facts label, and that includes any other nutrients that might be included. The critical piece with production and scale up is that you want to have a robust process that does not fluctuate over time, but that is the natural tendency, especially with raw materials that are from plants or natural sources. So as you're scaling up and you're trying these, you're going out and testing, confirming it's acceptable. You are looking at establishing the standards for quality assurance. If in the case of it's a food, it may be a marketer that's there to help establish the standards, or if it's a dietary supplement, a tablet, there are standards for dissolving and disintegrating. So that's part of the step. It looks relatively simple here, but it is a rather can be a repeated process and can therefore be a lengthy process. But best case, you did your homework, everything works, and you got the product in, you can move out the door. So this is an overview of the tablet manufacturing process. I'm going to use tablets as an example. You could substitute process, weigh and mill, and press tablets with mix and food bar manufacture, or different types of what they're called unit operations in here, and the manufacturing process would be very similar. But the bottom line is that as you go through the development or the manufacturing process, there has to be tests done as you go. So you procure the raw materials. There may be testing done before you even get those raw materials. But once you have those raw materials, they also need to be tested to confirm they have the activity, they don't have the bad bacteria, the microbiology. And then it will go into a next step where it be staged and getting ready. In some cases, it may be blended and sub batches will be made. In those cases, you may also need to analyze to confirm that you have uniformity within a batch, or to validate a mixer. So how long do you mix a blend to make sure that it's actually fully mixed? You can overmix it. So if you blend for 2 minutes and then make a sample, bottom, center, middle, and mix for another 2-3 minutes, do the same sampling, you do tests on those samples, and you find the point where there's the least variability. So there is an optimum time for blending. And if you overblend, then things start to separate. If you underblend, it doesn't actually get completely mixed. So, and then it moves from the bulk product into, once it's been tested and passed, then it goes into the package. There's a final test on that final product, which results in it being put on hold. And that final QA testing can take time. It takes a few days, maybe even a week. And that's often a pinch point where marketing and executives are looking to move that forward. And there has to be a risk assessment whether you can release, if you've done enough product and you know that you're very sure that it's going to be quality product again, you can move it right along and release. That's a high risk. Or you wait until your results are back. I've seen both. I tend to err on the side of conservative. That isn't how all companies work. Then as you are getting into production, there will often be new challenges that arise. One of the things that I've seen in the past, especially right now with supply chain, is that you have everything set up for a normal production, you're ready to roll, and then you find out that one raw material is only 80% of what you need. So I think it's important, and always is, from when I have done these types of tests, ensure every product, every ingredient, every component that's necessary to make the product is there and is acceptable. But this is the process of taking it from these testing that you've done and finally moving it into a long-term production. And they call it shakedown because when you shake things come loose, and you find problems that may not have been have come up on smaller runs or shorter runs. And so you have to run it for long enough to get to a steady state. That's a typical thing. As I mentioned before, there are standards for disintegration and dissolving for tablets, capsules, and soft gels. Food form supplements, require standards to be established, and that's typically done in combination with R&D, marketing, quality manufacturing may be involved as well. And then it may take, like I said, up to a week to be released by quality control, and that has been a common sales complaint. The challenge is that there is quite a bit of normal variability in raw materials, operators, and processing equipment. They all tend to vary over time. So you need to run and see what problems that you'll find and eliminate them as soon as they show up. So finally, you want to be successful, you need to not just let manufacturing off on their own and you can just forget everything as an R&D person and run along, do the next product. There's often work associated with normal production that may involve R&D and regulatory and quality. Often you'll need an alternative raw material because the current one is out of spec consistently, or has contamination, or has we can't even get it. And then there may be other issues with how it's actually performing in the machinery. And so that is something that you need to be able to work through with as an R&D person who's done the work and the manufacturing and the others that are in the plant. The reality is that the workers on the factory floor are often your best source of information. The executives and the managers and the leaders in the factory know a lot of what's going on, but the plant, the people on the floor, the people actually operating the equipment really are one of the best sources of information. And I always talk to them to make sure that I get their perspective as we're scaling up and getting into a steady state. Reality is shite happens, and you need to have technical people there to help improve it. Product improvements are also something that's on an ongoing basis, and it's also very common once you're up and in a steady state. There begins a focus on cost of goods sold and focus on alternative sourcing and changing process to make lower the cost. And then finally, you need to do some stability testing on an ongoing basis, because if you change the formula slightly, you may have to retest the stability. Some countries require ongoing intermittent stability studies. And so that will be a part that maybe involve R&D, but also quality and regulatory and some of the other folks that are part of the whole process and the part of the whole team that ultimately lead to that final product that the consumer loves and everybody is happy with it. And people are making wheelbarrows of money and they live happily ever after.